In this video, I will be discussing about some stereotype annotations. Okay, so what are the importance of stereotype annotation in the Spring Boot application project, that I will be explaining you in this particular video. So stay tuned till the end so that you will get to know like what are the importance of stereotype annotations and why it's an alias for a dead component. Okay. So basically, you have to understand the importance of the stereotype annotation. So it's a part of Spring component, okay, which is managed by the Spring component. So what are the stereotype annotations? So if you have worked upon Spring Boot, if you have not worked, still it's okay. It's like a basic thing. So if you start understanding the Spring component, Spring Bean, and all its important feature, and if you try to understand the annotation, so first annotation you will learn about is at Spring Boot application, okay, which is where the main method is being written. So there actually Spring Boot application contains configuration, enable auto configuration, and component scan. So these are the Spring Boot application is the composition of all these three annotations inbuilt within it. Okay. So there are certain annotations like component is there, okay, which scans all the necessary beans, okay, at runtime by the Spring container. Okay. But if I'm writing component in all the layers, so if you are using Spring MVC, you might be knowing that it's a design pattern, right? It contains model layer, view layer, and a controller layer. So similar to that, in our design project, whatever project you will be designing using Spring Boot application, so you will have to use like three different layers mainly. First layer will be the controller layer, second layer will be the business logic layer or the service layer, and third will be the DAO layer or the repository layer. Okay, so all will be having some specified annotations on top of it. Like controller will be having @controller or @rest controller. Okay, service layer will be having @service layer, and repository layer will be having @repository. So for that, if you will, I will show you through the code as well. Ki these jo annotations are there, right? @controller, @service, @repository. These all are aliases or another name for @component. So basically, you can replace up to some extent with @component as well. Okay, so let's dive deep into it. So first is @component. So if you can understand component, like it's most generic stereotype annotations in Spring which has been used, okay, and it is managed by the Spring. So it is a Spring managed component. Okay, so you don't have to focus upon how can you create a bean out of it. Rather, it will be like an inversion of control, and now Spring container will decide when you have to inject that bean during runtime, and its whole component is being managed by Spring alone. Okay, so it allows Spring to detect our custom beans. Okay, so at runtime there should be a Spring detection, so where exactly the bean has been created, so automatically it should get detected at runtime. So who does that? It's a Spring container which has already been created. The Spring container detects where all our custom beans are present, and it will detect automatically. Okay, and it will be injected as and when required. So those are the part and parcel of component. Okay, so next comes the Spring will scan our application for classes which are annotated with component. So basically there is a specific annotation for component scan. So it scans for all the base packages. Okay, it scans for all the beans which are necessary to be injected at runtime. Those will be scanned at runtime by the Spring container, and it will check where and all component has been mentioned. Okay, so wherever component has been mentioned, it will be instantiated and the dependencies get injected. Okay, and this will be marked as a specific bean type, okay, by Spring container. So this is the main component, which is component. Second comes controller. Okay, so this is one of the specialization, or you can say it's an alias for component layer. Okay, so basically you can replace controller with component, but it will not work out. I will show you through the code like what issue you will get if you replace controller with component. Do component, okay, has having an alias as controller, but still if you replace it, it will create an issue. Okay, so it is basically used to annotate the classes which handles the web request. Okay, so from UI, you are sending some request to get handled, and it will process some business logic. Okay, some service layer representation will be there where you will be writing your own business logic. Okay, so that particular layer will be handled at service layer. So that will be auto wired and the controller layer. Okay, so that the web request will be handled, okay, by the Spring MVC application. Okay, so typically the class annotated with controller will contain certain specific type of annotation within that, like @request mapping, or it will, if you can pass it directly like @request mapping, you will pass the URL, and then you can pass like whether it's post or get. Rather than using request mapping, you can directly write @post mapping, @get mapping, @put mapping, @delete mapping. There is a direct annotations which are provided to us. Okay, we handle this HTTP request, and it will return me the appropriate response as per the request you have been provided. So basically, @controller is nothing, it's an alias for @component. Okay, but you cannot replace it. So I will show you how in some time. Okay, so next comes @service. So @service is what? @service is specific specialization for @component. Okay, so it represents like this particular class is will contain the business logic. Okay, this particular class will contain the logic for writing the actual business representation. Okay, so it's a business layer, actually business logic layer. So it typically annotates the class, and it will contain the business logic and will perform operations such as some data manipulation or some validation logic if you are writing, or if you have to communicate internally through like async or sync communication. Okay, so there will be like a proper series communication, or there will be like an async communication. Okay, so there will be two types of communication. So async communication you can do using RabbitMQ or Kafka, or if you are using like synchronous communication, then in that scenario you can make use of REST template. So those are logics will be written in the service layer. Okay, so it's like a semantic hint which is being provided to the Spring container, signifying that this particular layer is being written specifically for this role for business logic layer representation. Okay, so whenever you have to focus on writing the business logic, then always and always we should go for @service. And here till date, we can replace @service with @component. There will be no issue at all. Okay, it will not throw any kind of exception or error, and you can very happily replace that. But if you want to specifically make the user understand like this class represents what, you should write @service. You should not write @component. It is not a best practice actually. So in Java you can write anything, right? It will work, but we should follow some best practices, right? Coding best practices we follow. So we should follow that, and then only we can move ahead. Okay. Then comes @repository. So it is also one of the specialized component for @component, or you can say like it's an alias for @component, and it annotates the classes which works as a data access layer, where it will communicate with your database and it will do certain CRUD operations. Okay, it can do like create, read, update, delete, where the database related operations will be provided. So there you have to annotate with @repository layer. Okay, so this layer where this @repository class is mentioned, it basically means that it helps us to interact with the DB and perform certain operation based upon that. Okay, so basically we are creating interface for repository. We are not creating classes. So within that repository layer where we are creating an interface, we extend. There are three types of repository, right? One is CRUD repository, one is JPA repository, one is paging and sorting repository. There is a hierarchical structure for that. So whenever you are going for CRUD operation, basic CRUD operation, you should go for extends CRUD repository. Okay, so whenever you are specifically using certain specific feature for JPA, like delete in batch. Okay, so there are certain specific methods which are present only in JPA. So if you have to use that, then you can go with extending JPA repository. Or whenever there is an application where we have to write logic based upon pagination, then we have to go for paging and sorting repository. So those particular repository also you can extend it happily. So that particular layer is an interface, and @repository is being written over that interface, which marks that particular class or interface has been marked as a data access layer. Okay, so here comes a difference between @component and @repository. So the higher level it's just an alias, but at a logical level it will not able to handle certain type of exception. So that also we have to understand. So basically if you are writing @repository over the DAO layer, so basically it signifies that particular layer is having that translation mechanism to translate persistent specific exception. Like there is certain type of persistence or DB saving operation. In that scenario, there can be certain exceptions might come. Like it may happen that SQL exception comes, or some data constraint violation exception comes, or unique constraint violation exception comes. So any type of exception that may occur due to certain DB operations which are not allowed. Okay, so in that scenario, if you are writing added component and if you are not writing added repository, then it will not be marked as a DAO layer, and it will not be able to handle those type of exception which specifically comes for database related operations. Okay, so in that case, it will not be able to understand like this type of exception are coming for data access or data storage related issues. Okay, so this data storage or data access exceptions will not be able to handle, which will not be able to get handled if you are writing added component. So we should be making use of added repository if it's a DAO layer. So this is the major difference between added component and all stereotype annotation. So apart from service layer, all needs to be written. Okay, so if you are replacing added service with added component, it will not create any issue, it will work perfectly fine. But added controller and added repository should not be replaced by with added component. Okay, it will give you inconsistent results. So if you are replacing added controller or this controller with added component, it will not work at all. It will not put a binding of request parameter with the web parameter request. Okay, so that binding will not be happening at runtime. So it will not be able to identify your endpoint. First of all, if you are replacing added REST controller with added component, so if you are hitting it through Postman, I will show you just now, like it will not be able to find that resource, it will not be able to find that endpoint in the controller level, and it will not hit your particular debug point if you are putting it over there, and that flow will not ever start. Okay, so that is very important. And added repository we have to use if you are replacing with added component, then Spring related exceptions which are database related exceptions are coming, so that will not be able to get handled, and the Spring data access exception will not be understandable by Spring. Okay, if it is not marked as added repository. Okay, so those particular features are very much important, and we have to understand it very keenly that whenever we are have to save data or update data in DB, so those DB related operations where exceptions might occur, then to make the operation perform smoothly and to make sure that Spring understand if what particular exception is coming at the DAO layer, then we should focus on writing added repository layer. Okay, so these are the components that we have to discuss it in this video. So this one is completed. So let's jump onto the code and see, like this I have written one logic, okay, for bookstore application. So basically what I have written, there is one application layer, one is controller layer, okay, where I've written get all books, where I'm getting all the books from the DB. Okay, so here if you can see the service layer, I've written this logic like bookstore service list. So basically what it will do, it will fetch the list of books from the DB. Okay, so if you go over here, I've written bookstore report.find all. So it will fetch all the books whatever are present in the DB, and I've override here bookstore repository. So here is the repository layer. Okay, so here if you see, it's an interface, and I have marked it as added repository. Okay, and it's extending JPA repository. I've created book entity, and this is the primary key data type. And from controller, if you see, I've written REST controller over here. So if I directly hit it from Postman, you will see what will be my response. So if you hit it from here, so here I am getting the output. So this is like get all books. This was the endpoint. Okay, so here you can see it's get all books. This was my endpoint, and it's working perfectly fine for me. Okay, it is giving me the list of results. So here if you can see, this was the data in the DB 101 Harry Potter and fiction, and here also data is coming perfectly fine. So it's no issue at all. Okay, it's working perfectly fine. But let's suppose I am replacing added REST controller with added component. I am replacing it. Okay, so now let's try running it. Let's reload it once, so it will automatically get restarted because I have added Spring Dev tool as a dependency. Okay, in POM file, so it will automatically get reloaded whenever I am making any changes over here. Okay, so let's run it through Postman now. I'm calling the same URL, get all books. Let's see. So here you see the output. What's output is coming? It's showing 404 not found. So basically, it's not able to find that resource. No static resource, get all books. So basically, it's not able to identify that particular endpoint which is being written in the controller layer. So it's already present in the controller layer, and I am passing the exact mapping get mapping, the exact URL I am passing in the request parameter, in the request URL. Okay, same parameter I'm passing it over here, but still it's not able to identify that endpoint. Why? Because for identification purpose, it requires binding of web request parameter. So for that, we need to pass @controller. Okay, so that is the annotation with the help of which it identifies, like this is the web request parameter handling mechanism, which has to be written in the controller, and then it will come here, because first it will go here and then it will come here. Okay, so we have to replace it with @REST controller. So okay, so if I'm replacing it with @REST controller, so let it reload. Yeah, it's reloading successful. And then after that, if I am hitting it, so I am getting the proper response. So this is important concept which we have to understand. Like @controller should not be replaced with @component. It will not give the proper result. And for repository, at some extent, it will work fine. Like if there is no database related issue, then it will work perfectly fine. So if I am going over here, it's a bookstore repo. Okay, so here I have written @repository. So if I'm replacing it with @controller layer, sorry, @component. If I'm writing @component and saving, let's see whether it's working or not. I'm running it. Yeah, it's working perfectly fine. Okay, so in certain scenario, basically this will not work when specific type of exception will happen. So this is a homework for you. You have to write some post mapping for yourself. Try to insert the record in DB which is already there, or create some kind of exception where exception will occur in DB. Okay, while fetching the data or while saving the data or while updating the data in DB. Then you can see like what's happening, whether it will work with @component or it's not working. So it's a best practice to have @service, @repository, @controller at their specific layers. Okay, so that will help us identify. And these all annotations are stereotype annotations, but these all are having their own importance. So we will replace it with @repository. Okay. So if you go inside this @repository layer, if I go inside this, here you can see it's an alias for component, link component value. So it's an alias for @component class. Okay, it's specifically written, it's an alias for component. So component is a specific different class which has been written. Okay, it's an interface, sorry, it's an interface specifically. So this was the thing that we wanted to show you. So if you go to controller and if you go to REST controller, then here it's an alias for controller. So if you go inside controller, here you can see it's an alias for component class. Okay, and if I'm going to service layer, here you can see it's an alias for component class. Okay, so these all controller, REST controller, service, and repository, these all are aliases for @component, but we should not replace it with @component. Okay, this is not a best practice. But @controller will not give the proper output. Okay, it will give 404. It will not be able to identify your static resource. For @repository, if there is no SQL or DB exception, then it will work perfectly fine with @component. But if there is any exception coming by any chance, then it will not work out. Spring will not be able to identify that it's a DB related exception or DB access related issues are coming. It will not be able to identify because you have not provided with @repository, which is giving certain type of semantic differentiation. Okay, so we have to provide that annotation as well. And @service specifies the business layer, and you can replace it with @component. It will work perfectly fine for you till time. Okay, so at later point of time, Spring may come up with certain restrictions for specific service, but as of now, it's not there. So I hope you got the clarity, like what all types of functionalities are present in stereotype annotations and how it works internally. I hope you liked it. So if you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe so that I will get the motivation to create these type of videos again and again. So it's Devjit Roy signing off. Bye bye.